All right, so up next, we have Andrew Lunny and Hardeep Shoker, who are doing a talk on PhoneGap Build. Our first one with two presenters at once. See how this goes.
Hello. Hey guys. Let's switch that. So I'm Andrew Lunny. This guy's Hardeep Shoker.
Hey.
And we're going to talk to you guys about PhoneGap Build today. I am Andrew Lunny, A Lunny on Twitter. I've worked for Natobi, going on to Adobe for about 5 years. Last two of which have mostly been on PhoneGap Build. I wrote a book about PhoneGaps, some of you might have known, but it's kind of out of date by now, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. I also came up with the name Apache Callback, so you can you can punch me later in the hall. Hardeep also works on PhoneGap Build. He's worked on PhoneGap Build for about a year, and if any of you have ever complained about the service on our support forums, then Hardeep's probably helped you with that. So you should thank him for that. He's a pretty smart guy, but he really likes PHP. So
sorry.
Yeah. So who knows what PhoneGap Build is? A few people. Okay. Has anyone used it? All right. Okay. So if you're curious, you can go to the URL. It's all over SSL because we handle sensitive stuff. Right now, it's in public beta, so you can use the site for free and do as much as you want. I know what Hardeep's doing, but yeah. So go and check it out. We've actually got a new design that we're not quite ready to launch today, but there's a sneak preview done by Ryan Betts, who is up there. It's got some different textures and colors than the old site, so that's pretty cool. So in a nutshell, PhoneGap Build lets you skip the SDK part of PhoneGap development. So what you do is you upload your code to our service. You get some apps back from the service, the binaries that you can install on your device. And then you can do what you want. You can develop using that. You can share the apps with people in your organization or clients and so forth. Or you can upload distribution certificates and actually get App Store ready binaries that you can submit to the Apple App Store or to the Google Play Store or to whatever else. We support 6 different platforms: Android, iOS, BlackBerry WebWorks, Windows Phone 7, WebOS, and good old Symbian. We have an API that works pretty well for people, despite its a couple of security issues. Don't worry about that. We have some pretty good support for our collaborators. So if you want to invite people to test your app or to contribute to your app, then that's really simple through our service. We have a hosted winery server running at debug.phonegap.com is kind of integrated with the service, but anyone who wants can go to debug.phonegap.com and try it out and use winery, so that's pretty cool. Thanks, Patrick, for making such a great service, or a great open source project that's really easy to run as a service. We have pretty tight integration with Git and with GitHub, and we're working on better GitHub integration. But the idea is you can really incorporate PhoneGap Build into your workflow and just push your code up to us, and then you get a new build of your new code. And we have Adobe ID support, which is pretty cool. But I'm not really a marketing type, as you may have guessed. So I'm not going to give kind of a product talk right now. I'm going to make some observations about what we found about PhoneGap and what we found about PhoneGap Build over the last 2 years. And hopefully I can whine at the PhoneGap contributors that are in the room. So the first thing we found out is that the internet is pretty hard. And the main point of this is that when you're building a PhoneGap app, you're typically dealing with some external resources, and that's been a big source of confusion for our users at PhoneGap Build. So most people take a few minutes and then they grok this idea that your PhoneGap app isn't running on a web server. It's a bunch of static files that are packaged in with your app that run on the file protocol. And that's a stumbling point for beginners, but they kind of get it after a while. And then we have this whitelist thing that if you've developed PhoneGap you're familiar with, where you can say, well, things on this domain are good and things on this other domain are bad, or things on these domains that aren't listed we don't trust, but it's kind of a little confusing. And then there are different kinds of external resources that you want to have different rules about. So there are some things you want to run in an iframe, for example, an ad, and then when someone clicks on it, you want that ad to open the system browser. You don't want that ad to open the iframe. You don't want that ad to take over the whole web view of your app. And it's actually quite tricky to do that declaratively in PhoneGap. And similarly with XHRs, sometimes you want to allow anything to go over an XHR, sometimes you don't, but it's kind of tricky to do that declaratively with the kind of simple whitelist that's in PhoneGap right now. So one solution that was proposed was this idea of a target equals blank that you put in a link. And if you're at all interested, there are some long, tedious threads on Jira and on the callback dev mailing list about this issue. I personally think we should have a really simple API that just says open this URL in a browser, because that's something that pretty much every app has to use. You have a link to your marketing site at the bottom of your app, and you want someone to click on it and open a browser. It's kind of strange that with PhoneGap this far along, that's still kind of tough. So another observation that we've had about Cordova, and this is quite an important one, although it looks like kind of a quibbling thing, is that Cordova apps aren't cross-platform. So if you have a Java application or a Flash application, then you have this runtime, the JVM or the Flash runtime, that gets compiled onto these different platforms, and then you have a project that runs on there. That's not what Cordova does. It's more of a template that gives you an app that you have on Android and an app that you have on iOS, and these things are actually quite separate. And this is a problem for PhoneGap Build, because when we're trying to abstract the SDK away, a lot of PhoneGap apps and a lot of documentation, a lot of tutorials still kind of assume that you have the SDK. So if you want to do X or Y, then you'll see a tutorial that says, oh, go in and modify the Android manifest XML, or go in and modify the whatever.plist file. And with PhoneGap Build, you don't have that, so it's kind of a weird thing. Because one of the sort of initial assumptions of PhoneGap Build was you could just say, this is my app, this web code, this index.html, this JavaScript, this CSS, blah, blah, blah. But it turns out there's actually stuff that's really important when you're, particularly if you want to release an app to an app store, that it has to be dealt with before there's any kind of JavaScript runtime being instantiated and there's any kind of app runtime being instantiated. So the obvious stuff is like an icon for your app, or the 10 different icons you need on iOS so you can support Retina displays and iPad Retina displays and iPad non-Retina displays and blah, blah, blah. And then slightly more, less obvious but more involved things like, well, I don't want my app to be suspended when the user goes to the home screen. I want it to quit immediately. And that's something you can't really create a JavaScript API, and you can't create a PhoneGap plugin to do that. You have to take into account the actual native package of the app. So thankfully, the W3C is on top of that, he said with great irony. And they have this spec for widget packaging and XML configuration. So you can define this file called a config.xml that basically specifies these things like icons and languages and various kind of declarative things about your app that are important for the run, that are important for the way the user interacts with the app, but aren't necessarily runtime JavaScript concerns. And the W3C spec is what we base our config.xml on at PhoneGap Build. And we actually have an open source project that I haven't linked to called Confetti that allows you to take one of these config.xml files and generate the appropriate platform-specific configuration files. But it's not perfect. This spec, I don't know if you can quite see on the screen, but it goes back to 2006, which is before the iPhone, before Android, before a lot of these platforms and the demands of these platforms were even known to the people writing the spec. So it's imperfect, but we've kind of massaged it in a way that it works for us. And this is kind of a whiny thing, but config.xml is kind of an overloaded term right now. So PhoneGap Build has a config XML file that's based on the W3C widget spec, and then PhoneGap 2.0 for Android has a config XML file that is basically a renamed Cordova.xml file, which is probably going to make the documentation for that really confusing. So hopefully that gets fixed in 2.1. And Don touched on this a bit about plugins. Plugins are the feature that everyone's requested on PhoneGap Build, and we haven't been able to have a good implementation of plugins for a bunch of reasons. And to my mind, and maybe it's just because I like to blame other people, but the problem is that there aren't really a lot of high-quality, reliable plugins. So what we want building a service on top of PhoneGap, and I think what a lot of developers want as well, are plugins that are cross-platform where that makes sense. So if you have an iAd plugin, then obviously that's going to be iOS only, but something like a barcode scanner should be cross-platform. And if they're cross-platform, then they should have the same JavaScript API for every platform they support, which sounds obvious, but if you actually look at the PhoneGap plugins repo, that's very rarely the case, which is really frustrating. A plugin should follow a consistent native API that doesn't change on every release that happens every month. Again, that kind of seems obvious. The fourth one I think is a really big thing, is that you really need to declare what the plugin needs. Instead of having a big long README file that says, oh, you move this thing to here in Xcode and you pull this thing and you add this framework and blah, blah, blah. You need to have that declaratively specified. And Don, in his talk, touched on some of the work we were doing to allow plugin authors to do that, so that tooling can be built on top of that. And the other thing that's important, as with all software, is documentation. And a lot of plugins just don't have good documentation. So those are all the things that we want. And what we have is this big PhoneGap plugins repo, which has a nice property that anybody can fork that and anyone can contribute to it. But it has some big problems. It's very difficult to look on this page and find a plugin. It's very difficult to discover whether there's a plugin that meets your needs. It's very difficult to test a plugin in an app if it's just sitting in one of these subdirectories in this giant repo. And if you're a plugin author and you want to make a change to your plugin, then you have to submit a pull request which gets approved or doesn't get approved by one of the moderators of the repo who is not involved in the development of your plugin. So I made a cartoon to illustrate the situation, which kind of sums it up. You probably can't read it back there. But. Okay.
All right.
So I'll be this guy, you be that guy.
Okay.
How do I make an in-app purchase?
It's not possible. Use a plugin.
Okay, how do I get the plugin?
Just clone the entire PhoneGap plugins repo and then drop it into Xcode and use it from there.
Did you just tell me to go fuck myself?
I believe I just did.
So that's that. Okay, so in that slide a while back, we talked about consistent native APIs, and I think this is a point I want to hammer home, because I actually think this is a pretty low-hanging fruit, and once we can all settle on this and actually decide what these native APIs look like, then a lot of the tooling and a lot of the maintenance for plugin authors is going to be a lot easier. So if we look at, for example, on PhoneGap Build, we have one plugin right now, which is the child browser. And the child browser for Android was originally developed by Simon McDonald, who spoke just a few moments ago. And I forked the plugin from Simon's, which is in the PhoneGap plugins repo. And the 1x release of my fork supports up to PhoneGap 1.4.1. And then the 1.5.0 release was when all the APIs changed from PhoneGap to Cordova. So it's like, OK, we'll cut a new release, we'll call it 2.0, and that'll support Cordova all through the future. And that was good for a few releases. And then 1.9.0 came out last month, I believe. And that started to merge in some of the changes that Joe Bowser was making with the Cordova web view. And that actually changed the plugin interface in a way that was not backwards compatible with the previous one. So it's actually impossible. Well, you can probably do some crazy Java reflection stuff to see what instance variables are available and so on and so forth.
Or you could
Or I could just get the activity in like a normal person.
Thank you.
But unfortunately, I'm not as smart as Joe. So we did a new release for 3x. And 4x, which we're going to have to do for 2.0, changes again because, as we touched on, the configuration file has moved over from Cordova XML to config XML. So hopefully we can fix the install script to kind of take care of that inconsistency. But realistically, if this keeps changing, then we're going to have to keep dealing with that. So I really don't think that's sustainable. We have one plugin on PhoneGap Build that we have to do this for, but our users aren't asking for one plugin. They're asking for 20 plugins or 50 plugins. And we can't review every plugin on every release of PhoneGap if there's one release a month. It's just not sustainable. But I think this is a solvable problem, and hopefully we can talk about it later today and figure out some ways to fix it.
I have this app here, which is the hydration demo. Basically, what I did was I just created a project and uploaded it. This is the project right here, I guess. You can see it. It just has some assets in it, and then it has some icons and splash screens, as well as this. Basically, it's just an alert in the index. And I also have this config XML that Andrew was describing before, and it just specifies some properties like the name, description, the author, and then it also lists the splash screens and the icons. So I am going to package this application up. And I'm going to feed it to build. So I'm actually just uploading a zip. You have the option of using a repository as well. We provide, we have repo hosting, but I think it's, So here's the zip that I just created. And I'm going to go ahead and upload this. And basically what I'm going to demonstrate is we have our two queues sitting right here, and they're waiting to compile the app. The one on your right-hand side is the native application compile, and the one on the left-hand side is a hydration compile. Just taking a look at the speed difference, the hydration one is already complete while we're still waiting on the native package to compile.
Yeah, so you can't really see on, probably on the screen, but the hydration build took about half a second. And the Android build is probably going to come out to, about 30 seconds.
Yeah. So I'm actually just going to install that now on my device. Just going to use the QR code. So I'll install it for Android. Okay, we have our application right at the top there. We'll go ahead and install it. And it's ready to run now. So I guess that's off the screen, isn't it? So we have a new hydration build available. We can update and restart. So it's going to go ahead and just grab the contents. And this is the device ready with a native compilation. So now I'm going to demonstrate the actual hydration compilation. So I just created my zip again, go back to build, update the code with that zip file, hit upload. Give it a moment for our Wi-Fi connection.
Not getting a request.
Yeah, this is where I do my little jig. No.
Yeah,
Well, the request isn't getting through, so. We'll just give it about 7 more seconds here. Otherwise, I will tether.
We got it, Joe. You guys are good? Yeah. Okay.
All right. Let's try this request one more time. This is, this has taken quite a long time.
Live demos, guys.
Yeah. All right. Let's give this one more shot. You want to just wait for it? Or?
I think we should just call it that.
Okay.
Well, we're still debugging how the feature works in a conference with 250 people, but is it going? It's connected.
Oh, there we go. All right.
SSH is probably gone.
Yeah. We'll just refresh this just to make sure it is actually completed like it is saying. So yeah, I guess it already updated. So what I'm expecting now is to be notified of a new build that's available.
If it's on the conference Wi-Fi, it probably won't be able to get it.
Live demos, huh? All right. Cool.
Yeah, the SSH connection's been lost.
All right. There we go. Okay. We have our new update available. Finally. All right, and it's ready to run, and it says I think it says hydration compilation there, so that was supposed to be fast. All right, I think I'll hand it off to Andrew. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah.